Okay, so one more round of applause for Jen, please. Our next speaker is Russ. Russ sent me a sentence about himself that I'm going to try to repeat here. I'm going to make sure that I'm saying it correctly. So apparently, he's built a flash game that got one senator so angry that he threatened to send the federal police after him. And I'm really eager to find out what that was about. But I never got a second sentence. I only got that one. So we're just going to linger with that a little bit and find more about it when we see
You're standing on it.
in the box. All right. Destruction and we've also just set up the feedback wall. So if you come into the space here on the right side, on your left, sorry about that. There is a feedback wall where you can stick up some post-it notes and tell us about what your experience has been so far. Tell us about the good things, the bad things, and we will take that into account and have a hard good look at ourselves. And we really appreciate the feedback. It's actually another job we really want. And with that, short of me going into another dad joke, I'm going to give the mic to Russ. Please give a round of applause for Russ.
Oh my God, it works. Hey everyone, I'm Russ. I work at IAG, but don't hold that against me. It's a big insurance company. So I'm going to be talking about accessibility in design systems, the pain and the glory. And in reality, there's going to be almost all pain and very little glory, just so we're upfront about that. So a bit about me. One of my roles is I'm obsessed with systems, but before I was obsessed with systems, I used to actually do a lot of audits, accessibility audits, not in the true sense like accessibility audits across site, but I would actually be deeply embedded in teams and I'd sit with developers and help them make their applications accessible. So some of the things I'm going to be talking about today is some of the stuff I've learned, and some of it's insanely simple. So feel free to nod off if it's something you've all heard before, but these are some of the things I've learned. Speaking of clickbait, as we've all been to do, this is at my 5 things to make a more accessible design system. So we're going to jump straight into it. And this term baking in is coming up a lot today. Someone was talking about muffins earlier. So accessibility should be baked in at all levels. And first of all, we should have a common understanding about baked in. So I had to go and look it up just so we're all clear. So it incorporates something as an integral part of a product, service or system. Make sense? But what does that mean for design systems? Well, really, we could look at it at the very high level and at the low level, and we're going to dive deep in a second. But fundamentally, they should be part of principles and practices and guidelines right up front. And so inclusive design should be included as part of your principles right above it. So those who don't know it, inclusive design is like a parent of accessibility. So it should be part of your core principles. And guidelines should have been put in place to help designers and developers actually achieve accessibility. If there's no guidelines, how are they going to actually achieve it? And there's things like practices. Now, these aren't generally part of all design systems, but they should be considered. And one of the things I'm always surprised about is people go to all this effort to write personas, and really you should be including disabilities as part of these personas. And the other thing is that things like user testing, the stat here is that 1 in 5 Australians has some sort of disability, and I have no idea how to go back. So if there's 1 in 5 people with a disability in Australia, when we're doing user testing, why aren't we actually including people with disabilities as part of that? And that's something we're working on with IAG at the moment to try and make that part of our common practices. So there's sort of high-end sort of things we can do. And now we're going to dive right down the other end of the spectrum, like talking about components and how they can be built. So fundamentally, every time you build a tiny component, you should build accessibility in or bake it in at that point. And that means both in design and development. When you're designing components, you should be thinking about color contrast, font size, and all those sort of things. And when you're doing code components, I know this is old school now. It's sort of depressing. One of the things I found, I do a lot of teaching with developers and going around and looking at people's code. 8-10 years ago, people were obsessed with valid markup and semantic markup. Can anyone remember that time? There was a period where this was like a common thing. when I talk to developers now, like, what the hell is semantic markup? It's sort of disappeared from the language, and it's so important. Developers should be using semantic and accessible markup. By semantic, we mean markup that's actually meaningful. So we're going to look at a couple little ways, and these are incredibly obvious, but it's stunning how many times I've stood in front of developers and said, do you do this? And they've looked at me blankly, and then I've cried. So these are insanely simple, so I apologise if you've seen them all before, but let's go back to 1995. So this is a label. That could be a form control. A form control could be an input, a select, a text error, etc. And number one, as insane as it sounds, I've come across systems where they don't use a label. Yeah? Every form component should have a label unless it's something like input type equals hidden. God, does anyone use it? Input type equals button, input type equals reset. Who the hell ever invented that? That was the worst thing ever invented on earth. But almost every form control should have a label. Why? So that it's got an accessible name. So here's an insanely simple example. Label, full name. So there we have it. It's a long way to make it accessible. And then all you need is this second step. Again, this should have been done for many, many years, but I still see people getting this wrong. And that's just using a for and ID attribute. And what it means is you now have a label, and it says for, and then a value. And then for your input or your select or text error, etc., you have an ID, and they're now explicitly associated. Now, this should happen even if you're wrapping the label around it. Now, again, this is something that I love, but I don't see people using as much anymore. And it gives so many benefits, which we'll see in a second. But you can wrap the label right round the label content and the input. When I talk to developers nowadays, they just sneer at this a bit, but it is so wonderful because you can inject messages in and they just automatically programmatically associated. But even if you're wrapping them around, you should use the for and ID attributes. And why do you do this? Fundamentally, this is for assistive technologies. And what does it do? It means that the label is announced when the form control comes in focus. So imagine a long form that you've set up and a screen reader user is going through it and they're moving down through the form controls and it's got name, email, mobile number and something else. If the labels aren't programmatically or explicitly associated, what they'll hear is input, 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 etc. Now, this used to happen all the time. I actually work with blind people. One of them is a very, like a power user. He actually has got so distrusting of developers, he actually runs his screen reader in read mode across a form first, and then goes into forms mode. And the reason why he does that, he just doesn't trust developers to actually code the forms correctly. So that shows how little faith he has in humanity. Which is true that we're all going to die anyway, so it's good to know. Nihilism for the win. The second one is inline error messages, and these worry me more because a lot of people shove them on the page and they don't bother to make them work really well, and it's so easy. So here we have a label, we have our form control, and you'll see it's in an error state now, so it's got a little red border around it, etc. We all know, of course, we shouldn't use colour alone, but let's just put that aside for a second. And we have our dynamically injected error message. Now that could be injected as the focus leaves the form control, or it could be done when you try and submit the form. Let's leave that aside for a second. But fundamentally, there's an error message now in there. So it's been dynamically injected there. And we need to programmatically associate that. Does that make sense? We need to programmatically associate that. And again, just like the label, so it's read out. This is what I see happen. People dump it in there as a paragraph after the input. Now, the paragraph is not tied to it anyway. And what happens is, when they move back through the form, a screen reader moves back through the form, they can't hear that error message. Because in forms mode, the screen reader only jumps through focusable items. That's a critical thing to understand. So, we need to programmatically associate. There's two ways to do it. The first way is insanely simple, and it's doing this wrapping. If you've wrapped the label right around, you can inject the error message inside the label, and it's a quick win. It's automatically now programmatically associated. So that's an incredibly quick win. Now, a lot of people have problems with this. You're styling the labels separately to inputs, and that's fine. If you're doing it that way, then you can use this beautiful thing, really well supported, called ARIA describe by. And what we have here is we have our label and an input and our error message below. And all we've done to explicitly associate them is used aria-describe by and make sure that it matches the ID value. Done. Now they're programmatically associated. And if you come in with a screen reader and you hit the focus on that element, it'll actually say phone number must be at least 8 digits. Done. Now, just to add a little bit to it, developers should also do a couple of other little bits and pieces. The first one is ARIA invalid and ARIA live. Just a little bit of extra tweakage. So these two add additional information for assistive technologies. And we're going to look at a before and after. So this is before the error. So right now, there's no error there. So we have our span sitting there waiting for the error message. We've got ARIA invalid false, because at the moment it's not invalid, so it's in a false state. We have this ARIA live attribute sitting there. What is ARIA live? ARIA live is sitting there saying, screen readers, this region of the page may update. I might inject something in here, so listen out for it. Does that make sense? So it's sitting there waiting. And then when we have the errors triggered, suddenly ARIA invalid goes to true. Now, when a screen reader hits that, it'll say invalid. But what's even better is the screen reader has been listening for this little patch there, this little region, and suddenly it's going, oh my God, and now it knows to read that error message because you've updated the DOM, and sometimes screen readers have a problem with that. So those two little extra tweaks make it a lot better. So one last thing to avoid on this one is using ARIA live assertive or roll equals alert. Now, I see people do this with the best intentions. So people will put roll equals alert on an error message on an inline form. And one of the problems is roll equals alert is exactly the same as ARIA live assertive, and both of them are what I would call shouty. They will overtake whatever you're reading out. So imagine this. You're jumping down through a form, you get to an error. When you leave that field, you've made an error field, you leave it, you go to jump to the next field, and the error message shouts across the top of it, and you can't even hear the field afterwards. So rather than try and take over the experience for people, using things like ARIA live polite means it doesn't shout over the top of them. So just be aware of getting overconfident with roll equals alert. The third one, now this one sort of still stuns me that we're going, again, we've lost all the things we've learned back from the dark ages. But if you're doing a radio group, you should have an overall description. This is just amazing. We'll talk about segmented controls in a minute, but people don't put an overall description there. And then there's our form controls, which are our radio buttons, and then we have our labels. Bizarrely, I've seen people, I'm going the wrong way, right, lost the plot there. Here we go, backwards. I've seen people mark that up as a label. Insanity. Did that sound too emotional? That is a label. They're the labels. But I've seen people do this. I saw it yesterday, if you can believe that. And I cried. The first thing, we always should have a description. If you've got a radio group, there should always be a description. Why? It's important for assistive technology users. One of the things people always forget is that when a sighted user can see a page, they've got context for things. So if you see a thing saying yes and no, there's some clue around it why you're getting to yes and no. But for a screen reader, keep in mind when they're in form mode, they're jumping from input to input using the tab key, and they will come across something saying yes or no. To what? So you need some context. So that's why we need to do it. The next thing we need to do is this thing from the 1920s. It seems to have gone out of fashion, but it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's semantic. It means something. It means this is a chunk of a form. So use the field set. And then back to our overall description, there's this beautiful thing called a legend, and that should be put just inside the start tag of the field set. But that being said, there we have it. So now we have our choose subscription type marked up in a legend. So now we have this beautiful scenario where this overall description is present and it's programmatically associated with the radio buttons. A win-win. And now what will happen is you'll get this. When you hit the tab key and get to that radio button, it'll say something along the lines of, depending on the screen reader, choose a subscription type weekly. Does that make sense? Now there's context for a screen reader user. Now, as I said, people have started using segmented controls and not realizing, there's a lot of UI designers I've come across who actually don't even realize behind the scenes, they're just a radio group, a style-up radio group. So the same rules should be applying. We should have an overall description there, because if you don't, the same thing is going to occur. A screener will come in and go, yes, no, maybe, to what? Is it for my life insurance being passed over to you? Well, they need some sort of context. So make sure there's an overall description. Then there's our hidden form control and our label, and please don't put a label up on top of these things. Make that the label. And the same rules still apply. Make sure there's an overall description, make sure it's wrapped in a field set, make sure it's wrapped in a legend. These are incredibly simple little examples of how you can bake accessibility in right down at the core components. And then I can see what you're thinking. We're done. Are we done? Everything's now 100% accessible. If our components are accessible, we can walk away. Who agrees? Well, that gets to tip number 2 of our clickbaity article. So accessible components don't mean accessible apps. So it's a very common problem that people think that if you bake it in very early, it just means everything's fine. And it's a very common mistake because in reality, as soon as you dump that component on a page, context may change. And even worse, regardless of how great your components are, you may have other parts of the app that's inaccessible. The way I've explained it to people before, and I don't know whether it makes sense, imagine your components are like a physical block, a brick being built in a house, and your application is all the mortar around it. I've worked on some things where there's very little mortar and there's lots of bricks, and that's fantastic because there's very little chance of being inaccessible. And unfortunately, I've worked on some applications where there's a few bricks and they're swimming in shit tons of mortar. And that's often where, you've got no control over everything and the mortar is probably highly inaccessible. And then you should just burn the house down. Just a point of view. So it's really important that we do accessibility at different phases. The first one is just on individual components. You should run tests on the components. You should do it on pages and layouts, and you should do it on your apps. And as I can't remember the speaker before said, fantastic. Don't leave it till the very end and then panic and shoehorn it in. Tip number 3, components should be built so they can't be broken. Now I'm going to talk about copy and paste, and I know there's a lot of React developers in the room, they're just going to roll their eyes and say, does anyone copy it? But there are people that are still out there who build systems that copy and paste. So component libraries should never allow developers to copy and paste. And I only say this because I worked on a massive banking site that should remain nameless, but developers could literally go to the component library and copy huge chunks of code and then paste it in. It just blows the mind. So these components are not updatable or manageable. They can be hacked and changed. And this is the part that I worry about. If you build this beautiful accessibility in there and a developer can mess with it, then what's the point? We may as well just die now. And just a thought. So fundamentally, components should be referenceable, not copyable, and we should make them so that you can't, I was going to say fuck with it, but that's wrong. So you can't, we can roll that tape back. So you can only adjust specific aspects of the component. So I'm going to look at the beauty of has anyone heard of Bootstrap? It's a tiny component library. Maybe no one's ever heard of it. No, okay. So Bootstrap, by the way, is really accessible. It's got some fantastic things in it. Right there, baked in, is a beautiful scenario. A lot of people think that modals can't be accessible. They can be quite easily. This is a beautiful modal. What happens here, there's a thing called role equals dialog. When that fires, it'll say dialog, and the user actually knows what's going on. So here's the thing. A lot of people forget context. When you click something and a modal comes up, a sighted user goes, holy hell, it's another goddamn modal. Whereas a blind user, they click something and something happens. They have no idea where they're going and what's occurring. I've just realized that I'm making it very hard for you to film me. This is fantastic. So anyway, I've lost the plot now. So what we should do is set the role to dialogue and then it announces it. And then this is other fantastic thing here. They have aria label by, and it's pointing down to the heading. So what is that doing? One of the things I worry about is often when people build a modal, they fire it and they send the focus down onto the first input. And so it'll say bank account details or something like that. And a blind user will be like, what the hell am I doing here? So there's no context about what's going on. So what you need to do is, what's great about the Bootstrap modal is it actually points to the first heading on the page, and now the blind user has context. So I know it's a modal, and I know it's about X. Now, I guess you can see where we're going here. So what happens is, if developers can either copy and paste it, or if they can edit parts of this sort of thing, they might do this, which is actually just take out that ID. Yeah? Very simple to do. If you allow developers to hack a bit with it, if you haven't set it up as a rigid component, then you can get things like the heading not being announced with the modal. So all that beautiful work that's baked in is now gone. Sad. Okay, tip number 4. The purpose of each component should be clearly defined. So we're going to talk about buttons versus links. I know where some people this is going. It's a world of pain. So it's very common in systems to make buttons look like links and links to look like buttons. And there's no problem with that fundamentally. So here's an example. Is that a button or a link? There's nothing particularly wrong with it from an accessibility point of view up to this point, but what really matters is their semantics, their meaning underlying them. They have a distinctly different purpose. So buttons have a specific purpose, and that is to do some sort of action. They were fundamentally designed to submit a form, and now we've bastardized them and taken them used for other things, and that's sort of okay, but we should use them for things like opening and closing widgets for action-based things. Yeah? They're for action-based things. Links are used to send someone to somewhere. They fundamentally have a different purpose. Make sense? Actions going somewhere. And if they're misused, one, every time you put a link instead of a button, a fairy dies. But secondly to that, it's very confusing for assistive technologies. So what will happen is when a screen reader hears the word link, they think it's going to go somewhere. So it'll actually say link, do something. They're thinking they're going off somewhere. Whereas in reality, they may be doing the opposite. You may be getting them to close something or trigger something. And of course, when they hear a button, they're actually thinking they're submitting a form fundamentally or doing some sort of action. So it's really important. And this gets back to semantics. Buttons have a purpose, links have a purpose. And one of the downsides in making it look the same is developers get lazy and they'll just slap one in. And what the designers decided visually then is irrelevant. But it does matter. Okay, so what does it all mean? The system needs to clearly define when these things are going to be used. So it tells developers, use them in this case. And we all know developers love reading the manuals, so there'll be no problems then on. Last tip, accessibility is responsibility of everyone, even your grandma. So there's a lot of accessibility testing tools out there, and they do help to make component libraries and design systems more accessible. And so we have things now, fantastic tools like color contrast plugins that you can put in Sketch, and that on the fly they're helping designers do color contrast. This is great. You can build HTML and CSS validators into build processes, so you can't run a build until the thing's valid. And there's great tools like Axe and Wave and Tenon. Anyone used any of these tools? They're great. They actually help you test components and pages and applications. But there's a big problem, and that is they're all pointless if people don't have an understanding about accessibility. And the reality is all of us have to understand the basic accessibility, if nothing else, at least in your own discipline. For UXers, you shouldn't have to know the details of how to code something accessibility, but there's stuff you need to be knowing. So here are a few things that UXers, UIs, and front-end developers should know about accessibility. Shall we go on a journey? UX designers. So UX designers, does this need to be said? It should have a basic understanding of markup. I was talking to a UX team the other day and I said, that would be a field set. And there was this blank stares. And once again, I cried. A lot of my life is crying. They should understand basic accessibility within forms. Things like field sets, legends, and labels. They should understand required fields. I was talking to a team the other day, and they said, they were jumping from page to page, and they said, well, all the things are required, so they would know now. It's actually a requirement that you tell people these things are required. Or do you want them to fail and then go, curse you? Maybe they do. So required fields, error messages, form instructions, they should know how the accessibility, the importance of these sort of things in terms of accessibility. They should know heading hierarchy. This is a basic thing of being a UX designer. Hierarchy. So they should understand what heading level should be used, when to use H1s, 2s, etc. And they should understand things like focus order. This is something that I've spoken to UX designers, and some of them disagree with me completely, but bugger you, I believe in it. So when I used to wireframe everything up, I would make sure that I would help define things for developers. That means if we're doing a pop-up date picker, God help us all, because they can be highly accessible. So when you're doing a date picker, you should tell them how the keystrokes travel through it, and don't go, just do it with a mouse. Everything should be keyboard accessible. So you should be able to say, what happens when you click that horrid little, calendar icon? Well, number one, focus should go to the actual little mini modal. And then what happens is a keystroke should travel through it. And what happens if they close it? Focus goes back to, these things should be defined, and they're better done by UXers. I don't know whether you agree, but rather than leave it to someone to either forget or tackle later on. What about UI designers? You've got off very easy so far. All the same things apply. All those things you should know as well. But on top of that, obvious things like colour contrast and use of colour, those sort of things. But things like, holy hell, how many designers you work with have got the best eyesight on earth and think that 10-point fonts are acceptable? They should be slapped with a glove. And I think we should bring back dueling so we can have a dueling glove and slap them and then stab them to death with a pointy needle. That might be just me. Not that I'm advocating violence. And the other thing is that I do believe in death, but not violence. The other thing is target size. Design, like, I'm now old, I've realised, because I can't see things on screen. And sometimes I find myself squinting to try and click on something, and I'm there, curse those designers. Target size makes a difference. Now we're on to the front-end developers, the bastards in the room. Oh, sorry. That was my inside voice. So front-end developers, I cringe to have to say this because it used to be so common. Now, I work with, as I said, with developers who just don't think like this anymore, but they should have an understanding of semantic markup. I was in a room recently, I said, what is the purpose of a div and a span? What is the purpose of a div and a span? He says, asking the room. What is so special about a div and a span? I know this man, he can't answer because he knows. He grew up in this world. Does anyone know what the purpose of a div and a span is? They've got a special purpose in this world. Because they're generic. Fantastic answer. Because they're generic. They're generic elements that have no meaning. That's the sort of thing that sort of keeps me up sobbing at night. So they should understand accessible form markup as well and table markup. Dear God, are we still building tables? Yes, we are for data tables. They should understand this most fundamental things. Every time I sit down with a team, I unplug the mouse and get my dueling glove ready to slap them because guaranteed they've forgotten to think about keyboard only. That you could do this today. You could walk home, unplug the mouse, and if you can't work your way through your entire application, you should pick up a dueling glove and slap yourself in the face. The other thing is that developers need to understand this thing called non-native. What the hell is that? If you're building something that's non-native, we're way in track. I think I've only got another 20 minutes. Sorry, was I not supposed to? So if you're building non-native things, you need to do additional work. Now, what the hell does that mean? So non-native means that there's no underlying meaning. And it gets back to these things like divs and spans. What we're saying here is if you're building an accordion, there's no accordion element. If you're building there actually is going to be a dialogue, but let's just say, leaving that for a second, there's no modal element. So you're using divs and spans. What does that mean? There's no underlying meaning. They're generic elements. So now you have a problem. It looks sexy as hell, but it's got no meaning when a screen reader comes to it. That's our problem. If only there was something we could do to help them. ARIA, fantastic. ARIA can be used to help them. This audience is amazing. So non-native widgets include things like modals, buttons, drop-downs, accordions, anything where there's a non-native element attached to it. What do developers need to do? Well, they need to put on their hats. Some sort of hats, I don't know, any hat. And they need to do things like define an accessible name. Before we saw role equals dialogue. That's an accessible name. Tooltips, things like that. There's actually all this ARIA for them that helps define them. And when a screen reader hits it, it goes, I know what you are. And it helps define them. The next thing you should be doing is telling them the state. I was just looking at an accordion today and it could open and shut. And it was amazing. And sadly, I kept opening and shutting because it looked really cool. So I have to stop myself. But when I turned the screen reader on, there was nothing. There was literally nothing. And what's worse is what opened out was 10 more options, but there was nothing to tell me that those options were open. So you need to tell them the state. Hey, it's open now. Or I've closed it again, etc. You can even say it like that if you want. And then you need to determine the relationship. Is this being owned by something or is it interacting with something else? All this can be done. But these three things, giving it a name, telling it its states and relationship, are critical if you're just blobbing things on the page with divs and spans. Make sense? Conclusion. It's not easy. It's painful. However, we can all do it one step at a time, and it's a journey, not a destination, and we're all going to die.